Hi, welcome to Solar 2012. Solar power became the most installed energy source in Europe last year, and solar power's generating capacity is predicted to grow by 200 to 400% throughout the world over the next 5 years. Join us for an interesting and informative hour as we discuss solar energy, the pros, the cons, how it compares to other energy sources, how it is being used by the military, and its potential to positively impact our economy, our environment, and your own energy costs. With us for this discussion are 3 guests who are each professionally and passionately involved in solar energy. Kevin Cook works with Technicians for Sustainability, a local solar installer, and has been designing and installing solar systems since 1998. He and his family live with solar, electric, and hot water. Nancy LaPlaca currently serves as policy advisor to Arizona Corporation Commissioner Paul Newman. She is an energy policy expert specializing in electricity, water, and natural gas. Bruce Plank is the solar energy coordinator for the City of Tucson. He served on the Tucson-Pima County Metropolitan Energy Commission for 3 years. He lives in a home with solar electricity and solar hot water. Kevin Cook, Nancy LaPlaca, and Bruce Plank, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's begin, Kevin, with a very brief definition of solar energy and photovoltaic PV for people who are watching.
Sure. Photovoltaic systems, most people when they think about solar systems these days are thinking about solar electric systems, also called photovoltaic systems. It's a set of panels that go on your roof or the ground near your house and produce electricity from sunlight.
Okay, so when any of you mention PV, the rest of the show, that's what that refers to, correct? Yep. Okay. Bruce, there's also solar hot water. Can you differentiate between the two?
Sure, that's easy. Solar hot water is basically using the sun's heat to heat up water in one kind of storage capacity or another. It's pretty much the same principle as why the water in your garden hose in Tucson gets really, really hot in the summer.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Okay, let's start with how we compare with the rest of the world in terms of our use of solar energy. Anybody want to tackle that?
Well, the United States, we are now a minor player. Back in the 90s, until the mid-90s, the United States was the world's largest manufacturer and exporter of solar. And now we're down to only a 5% world market share. And it's interesting that the cloudy country of Germany has half the world's installed solar PV. So countries like Italy, Germany, Spain, they're really moving far ahead of us.
Mm-hmm. And what about China? Because there was recently something in the news about the tariff that was the U.S. placed on Chinese imports of solar panels.
You know, China, I'd like to hear from my colleagues here, but China was able to produce solar panels cheaper, and basically they drove the price down below the cost of production. Mm-hmm. And so they very quickly captured a lot of market share. They have over 30% of the market mm-hmm. share. And so there's a battle going on now. You know, Kevin, do you want to address that?
Well, the thing that I would say about China is that they invested heavily in the manufacturing sector. They weren't really putting as much of an effort on the installation side. So Germany really focused on installation, and manufacturing came out of that. But then other countries started supplying it, principally China. So China has really taken a leadership role in terms of manufacturing and is only now starting to work, although very quickly catching up, on the implementation of solar generation projects.
Mm-hmm. And if you look internationally, we're now seeing solar being introduced very rapidly in North Africa, in India, all throughout other countries in Europe, more and more in South America, as well as the other countries that Nancy and Kevin mentioned too. So it really is an international phenomenon that's spreading pretty rapidly. But the United States is gaining too. It's just a different level of play than we've had in the past, as Nancy mentioned.
And how supportive has this administration been of solar energy?
Well, I guess I'll take that for a minute. The current administration has been very supportive of solar in the sense of putting money directly into different projects, as well as providing loan guarantees and other things like that. But it all depends on how big a perspective you're looking at. There's certainly more effort by this administration to support renewable sources of energy than there has been in the past. Many of us believe that it could be a lot more.
Of course. Okay.
And there are a few programs. One is Section 1603, which is a program that was initiated in 2008 when the economy started shrinking. They decided that it wasn't enough to give companies a tax break. So what they did was they gave cash in lieu of a tax break, so that if you didn't have a tax appetite, you couldn't take advantage of that type of structure. So the Section 1603 gave tax grants, and in fact, Arizona benefited heavily from that, and we had $165 million worth of projects. And so there's certain programs, property assessed clean energy as one, Section 1603. So the administration's done a good job, but I hope they do more.
Okay. Now, what about Arizona? And my understanding is that Governor Brewer is supportive of solar power.
Well, Arizona has recently been listed as the third, the third highest adopter of solar in the country. So we've done very well. We've had a very robust 2 years of installation practices. What I would say is certainly the governor's office has been very supportive. A lot of the solar policies come from the Corporation Commission. Some of them come from state legislation. But what's important to remember is that we're looking at implementation now that was related to policies that were made 2, 3, 4 years ago. So the policies that are being made now aren't so much determining our national rank today, they're determining what our rank will be in years 2, 3, 4 down the road from now.
Mm-hmm. Do you, Nancy, because you're there in Phoenix, do you find the state legislature supportive of solar?
The state legislature has been a little schizophrenic. So some of their policies literally would have thrown our industry into chaos. There was a bill this last session, House Bill 2789. And because it called into question the Commission's authority over renewable energy policy, if that bill had not been eventually killed, then we would have a much more difficult situation here, because what businesses need are certainty. They need certainty. They need policy certainty, because like Kevin said, what we're seeing today is the result of policies that were made a few years ago. The Commission, one of the interesting things about the Arizona Corporation Commission is that because it's an elected body, you're never really sure what's going to happen one election to the next. And because our standard, which is 15% of regulated utilities, electrical generation, in other words, all the megawatt hours, all the kilowatt hours that they generated, have to come from clean energy by 2015. That policy is set, it's a rule, but from year to year, the Corporation Commission can change it, they can waive it. Mm-hmm. So there's a certain amount of uncertainty. The legislature has done some things that have helped solar and some things that haven't.
Okay. Okay. I understand also that there are now 5,600 solar companies in the United States, and at the end of 2011, 172 of them were in Tucson. And Tucson has been recognized by the Department of Energy as a solar American city, one of only 25 in the country. Bruce, what does that mean? Well, it sounds good.
No, I think it sounds great, Cynthia. What it actually means is that a few years ago, the United States Department of Energy chose to pick out different cities around the country that were taking an active role in developing solar. The city of Tucson, for example, has been putting solar on city facilities since 1999 and has done a bunch of other policy changes to support solar. And I think it was acknowledging that history of doing solar in Tucson that led to Tucson being chosen as one of the 25 solar American cities. the only one in Arizona and the only city really to be so chosen in the Southwest. And I think that Tucson has lived up to that in the past few years by continuing to put up solar on city facilities, as well as changing policies to make solar more accessible for the average person in Tucson, as well as businesses, and leading the way for other government agencies too.
When I first moved here, one of the first questions I asked was, why isn't solar energy a part of every new home that gets built, at least in southern Arizona? Is it the reason that that hasn't happened, because we certainly have the sun, is the reason it hasn't happened political, or people are resistant to change, or Kevin, do you work with this?
Yeah, I think so. There are sort of two parts to the question that you just asked. On new construction, it's very difficult, or it's somewhat challenging, I should say, to get solar installed as part of the home construction process, because solar is still an industry that is dependent, less and less so, but it continues to be dependent on incentives. The home builders have a harder time capitalizing on those incentives than a homeowner. So once you've occupied the house, you can get a tax credit. But the home builders, it took some time for them to figure out a mechanism where they could reduce the cost of solar through benefiting from these incentives. So that was part of it. The other part of it is really that home builders are putting a lot of capital into a project and counting on somebody being interested in buying that project. And until solar really became acceptable on a fairly widespread mainstream level, home builders were nervous to step out and put that kind of capital into their projects. And one really interesting thing that we've seen with the crash in home building over the past 3 years has been, we've now seen an almost wholesale swap where home builders weren't installing solar before, and now you see it on many of the home building, new construction projects, because they see it as a feature that will help them sell their home, whereas before they were worried it was going to prevent them. So part tax credit, part public opinion.
So more a result of money and financial concerns than lobbying by any other energy industries. Is that what I'm hearing?
Well, I wanted to add one other piece to that, and I think that one issue that we have in Arizona, and it's a good and a bad thing at the same time, is that electricity is fairly cheap here. And in some other states, Hawaii, for example, or in New York, and some other states where electricity is much more expensive, the relative cost of solar is an easier sell. In Arizona, where electricity is cheaper, it's been a little more difficult to bridge the gap between the regular cost of electricity and the kind of costs that you would have for electricity from solar. So we're happy to have lower electricity prices, but in a funny way, I think that has slowed down the impact or the spread of solar to all or even many of the buildings that are built.
Yeah,
Where does our, oh, I'm sorry.
so if I could capitalize on what Bruce said here, that gap is a key issue, because when you have a state that has cheap electricity, then it's harder to bridge that gap, right? So we have an incredibly good solar resource, but we also have really cheap electricity. So compare us to California. They have a good solar resource, not quite as good as ours, but very good. But their cost of electricity is so much higher that they have less of a gap to bridge. And then to capitalize on what Kevin said, the state of Hawaii, which has no fossil fuels, they import all of their natural gas, all their oil, all their coal. They had a policy that all new housing had to be stubbed out for solar hot water.
Stubbed out.
No,
Stubbed out.
they had to install.
They had to
It had to be
install solar
installed.
hot water in all new housing. And so as a result, literally, Hawaii had a third to a half of the total solar hot water, domestic solar hot water, in other words, you put in your house, business in the entire United States for many years.
But that's actually a good example of one of the things that Tucson did as a Solar America city, because the city of Tucson does require that all new single-family homes and duplexes be equipped and be prepared, stubbed out if you want to use that phrase, for solar hot water as well as for solar electricity in the future. So the homes that are being built now are ready for solar here. And that's one of the things that the mayor and council of the city of Tucson did to make Tucson more of a solar-friendly place.
That's great. Where does our electricity come from now?
Well, our electricity, we're an interesting state because we export a third of our electricity, and that's a lot. So so the numbers change. If you're talking about what we use in state, it's about half coal, about 25% nuclear, and 25% natural gas. And the numbers move depending on the year and the time of year. We have about 5% hydropower, which is dams, and really only about 1 to 2% right now of renewable energy. If you're talking about our total electricity, because we export a third, then the numbers change around. We're about 40% coal, about 28% nuclear, natural gas, but we're basically a lot coal, a lot of nuclear, and a lot of natural gas.
We have a graph that we'd like to put up now that shows, that you brought in, that talks about the non-hydroelectric and Arizona's progress in the last 10 years, if you could address that.
And then this is an interesting chart. It's from the Energy Information Administration, which is part of the United States Department of Energy. And if you go to the website, there's more information than you could possibly know what to do with. But basically what this shows is the difference in between 2001 and 2011 in non-hydro renewables.
Which means?
To unpack that, some states have huge amounts of hydropower, like Idaho, Washington State, huge amounts of hydro.
Water.
Water, right. So electricity that comes from water falling and turning a turbine, and that's how you get electricity. We're about 5% hydropower in this state. So we're excluding hydropower because it skews things, because otherwise states like Idaho and Montana with a lot of hydropower would look a lot different. So what this shows is that in 2001, there were 15 states that were less than 1% non-hydro renewables. In other words, solar and wind. We're not talking about nuclear either. So let's fast forward to 2011, which is on the right. All those darker colored states have a greater percentage of renewable energy. We are still at less than 1%. Now, it varies utility by utility. Some utilities are at 2%, some are close to 3%, but overall, we're losing ground.
Okay. How does solar compare to wind in terms of how efficient it is, how expensive it is, how widespread it is?
Well,
Bruce?
first of all, you have to have the resource. And southern Arizona is not a particularly good place for wind. There are certain pockets that are around, and people may have noticed the new Vail Academy out east of town on I-10 that does have both solar panels and wind turbines. But northern Arizona has some pretty good wind resources that are being developed now. Wind and sun are both the same in the sense that they provide a really good source of electricity when they're available. If it's really cloudy or if it's night, you're not going to get solar energy. If it's calm weather for days and days, you're not going to get much wind energy. But when they are producing, and as we know, the sun shines a lot here and the wind blows a lot in northern Arizona and elsewhere, when they are producing, there's no fuel cost, they're completely clean, and they provide a really important source of energy. They're being developed in different parts of the country that have different resources. But in southern Arizona, our big resource, of course, is sunshine.
Solar.
One of the things about wind, too, is there are certain parts of the country that have such an astoundingly good wind resource that they beat us. And so, of course, where's the money going to flow? It's going to go to where you're going to get the most wind energy for your dollar. And that's not Arizona right now. It's Texas, Colorado, New Mexico, kind of goes straight up the country for from Texas. But I understand from wind people that, you know, we have a decent resource here. We have about 200 megawatts of wind right now, and I hope we get more.
Do you think, Kevin, that the future, I'm guessing it's going to be a combination of wind and sun and solar and other things, but will either wind or sun play a bigger role throughout the country and throughout the world? Do you have a crystal ball there?
Well, I don't have a crystal ball, but if I were to wager a guess, I mean, certainly piggybacking on what Bruce said, it's going to be regionally specific. There's no question that in southern Arizona, solar will be the resource that we use for renewable energy and not wind. That's clear. Similarly, in Wyoming, coastal areas, parts of Texas, those places are going to use wind, at least before they use solar at this point. We've seen dramatic decreases in the cost of solar. We have seen an improvement in the wind technology, but I don't think the costs have dropped quite as much, quite as rapidly. So I think it's anyone's guess where the prices will go for the competing technologies. I shouldn't say competing. Really, we need both resources. We need as many of each of those resources as possible, and ultimately, we're going to see those resources in regionally specific places.
Okay, let's talk money again. What about, we've talked about subsidies a little bit and government support for solar. Let's talk about their support for nuclear, their support for fossil fuels, coal, and their support for renewables, and how much equality has there been since solar and wind have really been on the horizon?
Well, there's a great study called What Would Jefferson Do? And it was done by an investment company called DBL Investors. And the woman who wrote the study, Nancy Fund is her name, she took a look at energy subsidies over the history of our country since the 1900s. And basically what she found was that oil and gas, of course, has received the most subsidies because they've been getting subsidies since 1918. And nuclear received so many subsidies starting in the 50s when we first really started investing in nuclear that at one point it was actually 1% of the total budget of the United States. And so what Nancy discovered was that the intense investment is in the first 15 years. So you've got to look at the time frame too. We've only really started investing in renewables in the last couple decades. So it depends on what time frame are you talking about. But if you want to compare just in broad terms, renewables, nuclear, coal, and oil and gas. Oil and gas has received the most. Nuclear has received, it was $186 billion in subsidies, lots of subsidies. Coal has received a lot of subsidies in terms of tax benefits, railroad benefits, all kinds of sort of hidden benefits. And then nuclear is renewables are such a new player that there's not really, relatively speaking, that many subsidies.
Okay. Without going off topic too much, why is nuclear, considering it's so expensive and has the potential to be so unsafe, why is it still touted even among some environmentalists?
You know, if you don't mind me taking a hit at this, it's nuclear power has a lot of political clout and a lot of money behind it. And if you look at Palo Verde Nuclear Generating Station, which is a very safely run plant, it's very safe. In terms of nuclear power plants around the country, and we have 100 units in this country at 60 different sites, we've got lots of water out there, there's no earthquake possibilities, it's a very safe place. It was built, it came online in the mid-'80s. Power from that plant is 4 cents a kilowatt hour. Compare that to new nuclear, which is 20 to 25 cents a kilowatt hour. So that's really the big difference, Cynthia. And a lot of people don't understand. They look at Palo Verde and they say, 4 cents a kilowatt hour? Why don't we build more of that? But the truth is that if you built a nuclear power plant today, it's far more than solar.
There are a few people that also, Cynthia, I think, believe that the greenhouse gas situation is so dire that it's worth it to have the risks of nuclear power because there are no carbon emissions. The problem with that logic is there are no carbon emissions from solar either, and there's no fuel, there's no mining, there's no waste, there's none of the other things that go along with nuclear power, and you still get the same climactic benefits. So your question is still just as good a question, and I'm stumped by the answer myself.
Okay. That's a perfect lead-in to talk about the pros of solar power, and there are a lot of them. And Kevin, would you like to, since you're installing them, give us some that Bruce hasn't mentioned yet?
Yeah, well, you remember that solar power can be deployed on a utility scale where, you're talking about some of the photos at the beginning of the show, acres and acres of solar panels, and it can be deployed on somebody's house. You have 10 panels or 20 panels. So I'll speak to the systems on people's homes. Both, obviously, I believe have a place, but the real significant benefits that I see are, first of all, it's a technology that doesn't use any water, doesn't emit any carbon, doesn't emit sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxides. It's a technology that's it's clean, and it's sustainable. It's not taking away from our ability to have a high quality of life 10, 20, 50, and 100 years from now. So that's really the most, I see, a tangible benefit of these systems. The secondary benefit that I think is sometimes overlooked but is really, really important is that the ability of an individual or a business in our society today to implement, to build their own power plant on their property is incredibly empowering. And we have seeded over the past 100 years our connection to how we get our resources, in this case, our electricity. We just go and flip a light switch. It didn't used to be that way over 100 years ago. We had to figure out whether we were going to light a fire to heat some water or what you were going to use to get your electricity. So by having access to solar panels, both hot water and solar electric photovoltaics, people are empowered to produce their own electricity with a source that they feel is important. That engages the public in the dialogue about energy use. It engages the public about the energy use in their own home, conservation, being aware of what happens when they flip that light switch on. So those, to me, are the two most important benefits. I think there are many, many other benefits. The third that I'd mention that's kind of a meta-level benefit is we can't just say, you know what, we want solar energy in Tucson or in Arizona or in the United States. Let's just switch over. 100% renewables by next year. It can't happen that way. And one of the real benefits of implementing projects now is the step-by-step growth in the industry and in our infrastructure, and the slow, gradual momentum that builds up in creating the changes that will be required for us to move to higher and higher proportions of renewable energy.
Mm-hmm. Well, not only are it's abundant renewable energy, but it also provides diversification for the energy supply. And that's what I think you're talking about, the gradual bringing in of different kinds of energy. In our bad economic climate, there's also job creation with solar energy. And Bruce, do you want to address that?
Well, sure. I think that's an easy one, Cynthia, because in the short time that we have had the big housing slump in Arizona, there's certainly been an expansion of the solar industry. In fact, there have been times when at the city and county permitting offices, about the only people that were pulling permits for construction were people that were doing solar projects, because they have been a continuing source of employment and an expanding source of employment. And it's great work. It's not work that can be shipped out overseas. Mm-hmm. It's putting panels up on people's houses, or even larger projects, putting panels on racks, whether it's on a big project out in the Avra Valley or a small project at someone's home, is going to provide employment for people. And as Kevin said earlier, it's good, clean, local, empowering work. And it's not going anywhere. It's staying right here in the community, and that money's staying in the community. So the solar industry is an important job creator, and I think it has been and will be for Tucson and southern Arizona.
It's also, isn't it also a potential for manufacturing and exporting worldwide, because Europe and the rest of the world, Africa, they are taking advantage of solar. So there's a potential there for growth and more jobs, yeah?
It's huge, I think. And if you look at, what's interesting when you look, 30 states around the country have renewable portfolio standards. In other words, they passed a rule or a law that said, hey, utilities, you have to get X percentage of your electricity generation from clean sources. And there's a lot of variability among those 30 states. But one thing I think that's pretty clear is that however we move forward, whether it's a federal energy policy, some kind of minimal standard, or carbon, price on carbon, Arizona is a winner. Because that area out by Yuma is one of the highest insulation, in other words, the highest generation per square meter in the world. And so when you think of our potential to export clean electrons, it is enormous. And also, you know, when you look at states like Ohio, Illinois, I mean, Michigan, they don't have the potential that we do for generation. And so as certain states start to implement their renewable portfolio standards and we trade these credits, we have a huge potential to be a solar exporter of solar credits. In other words, you're Michigan. You need to get some solar, you know, you can build the plant here and then offset some of your own fossil fuel generation. So we have huge potential.
I was also very happy and surprised to learn that the military is using so much solar power. Apparently, they're using the panels on the front of on the front lines to minimize the need for fuel convoys that are targets. So they're making our soldiers safer using the solar power. And I understand, and you could talk about this more than I, Davis-Monthan is one of the big users as well, our Air Force base here.
Sure. I mean, Davis-Monthan has one of the largest solar installations in Tucson right now on the housing on base. And the base itself is in the process of putting in a very large solar electric field to meet some of the power demands of the base. And that's true of other Air Force bases, Luke near Phoenix, Nellis in Nevada, and elsewhere. And that's basically true. Well, actually, another example would be the VA Medical Center in Tucson has a very, very large solar parking structure complex, as well as solar hot water and so forth. And Cynthia, you mentioned reducing the fuel convoys, and part of that is that if everybody's using electronics in the field, you're going to have electricity to power up those cell phones, sat phones, GPS equipment, and so on and so forth. And you can provide that electricity to charge that equipment by running gas or diesel generators if you want to wait for the fuel convoy and hope it gets there. Or you can put out solar panels to charge that equipment and get the same electricity without the fuel convoy, the cost of the fuel, which some people say is up to $400 a gallon, the danger, the military expenses, and so forth. So I think the military really has seized on the value of using renewables.
I also read regarding the military that they're trying to reduce our dependency on oil, and because of climate change, they are implementing the clean energy, clean air technologies because they consider it a threat to the country to be so dependent on oil and climate change as well. So that's kind of a big plus for solar energy that I think most people aren't very much aware of.
And as we move more towards electrification of transportation, that's going to become more and more important. So electric vehicles, as we, most of our liquid fuel, of course, goes to cars and transportation. So as we can move that to clean electricity, that's pretty exciting. I mean, think of it, if you have solar hot water, solar electric heat, and then you have a electric vehicle, you basically just reduced your overall footprint for almost all your toxics by 80%, 75%, huge amount.
Okay, I'm on board, but I know that there are some negatives, as much as we'd maybe not like to address them, but there are a few things that are maybe inconvenient about solar power, or I did read that in the manufacture, transport, and installation, that can cause pollution, so it's not totally clean, and that in the manufacturing of cells, there is emission of greenhouse gases. How serious is that? Because I don't hear much about that either.
Yeah, so different technologies have different emission or footprints. The average industry numbers are that a solar panel will, over the course of somewhere between 6 months and 2 years, depending on the technology, produce the energy it took to manufacture the panel and install it. So, yes, we still have infrastructure that provides electricity and transportation that's based on fossil fuels, not renewables, but that's many steps ahead of the infrastructure that supplies electricity currently. So it's a step in the right direction, and as I said earlier, that stepwise process, as we build more and more renewables, the generation and manufacture of these products and the installation will become more and more based on renewable fuels. Many of the manufacturers, for instance, have large solar arrays that power their facilities. So we will, as we take one step after another, we will see a reduction in that footprint in the production of the solar panels.
One of the things I want to mention that Kevin said is a key concept is life cycle analysis. So, our earlier discussion about nuclear or really any generation source, we have to start looking at life cycle analysis. And this is something I think that young people and people who are studying, sustainability issues sort of get, that the benefit that the fossil fuel plants have well, they've basically gotten this for the last 50 years, is we looked at everything in isolation. We didn't consider that when you build that pipeline, and the pipeline might explode or leak, or the cost of natural gas is going to go up and down, we don't really look at our current generation fleet in terms of life cycle analysis. And really, that's the key question. So, I say don't pick favorites. Don't pick a favorite. But the key question is, when we look at generation, whether it's coal and coal ash and all those, all of the emissions, the health effects, those kinds of costs, let's look at life cycle analysis for everything.
Okay, let's go back to a few problems with solar. You can't get 100% of your electricity from solar, correct? How long do you think it's going to take before that becomes a possibility?
Well, let me try to take that one, Cynthia. I guess it depends on how you look at it, because you could choose to have a solar system at your house that did provide all of your energy if you're willing to have batteries and do your solar system that way. Most people nowadays choose to use the local utility company as a battery, and so at night they're getting electricity from the utility company, and during the day they're generating solar electricity. But one of the really exciting trends that I see happening around the country and here in Tucson is moving to what's called net zero energy, meaning people that are generating enough electricity during the day and during the over several months that they're equaling the amount of energy they're taking from the utility. So in the end, they're coming up with a zero balance. So if you want to look at it that way, those folks are essentially generating all of their electricity, or you could go the battery route and do that and live off-grid, where you generated all of your electricity through solar panels and batteries. So it's possible on an individual level. On the societal level, I think it's going to be a while until we really develop enough capacity to either bring in electricity from other sources, like for example if it's windy in New Mexico at night and we're bringing in renewable electricity from somewhere else, you might be able to do things that way. So I think similar to what Nancy and Kevin said earlier, I think we're moving in that direction, but generally, sure, we're not there yet, and we might not get to a point where every single electron that's generated is from renewable sources, but the steps we're taking are great, and I think we are moving in that direction.
What about, this brings us to storage, which is a critical component of this, because there are, solar energy is intermittent. I mean, it fluctuates depending, if we go 5 days without sun, which doesn't happen here in Arizona, but it happens a lot of other places. So you have to have, I'm guessing, the ability to store this energy. So,
yeah,
Kevin?
I think you know, for me, that's an extension of your previous question, where it's absolutely possible for us to produce 100% of our energy from renewables. We have to figure out how we're going to do that, and we're at the very early stages. As Nancy said, our state is in the 1% range. You know, some of the utilities are up at 3%. We can't even fathom what 100% looks like, but that doesn't mean it's not possible. There's no question that we can reach 100%, and the steps that we take to get there will be laid out in front of us as we walk down that road. So storage is certainly a possibility. It's been discussed quite a bit, and there are lots of different interesting storage ideas that are out there. Compressed air storage using salt caves to, you know, pressurize a salt cave and then have the air blow back out and spin a turbine when you need that electricity. Hydro can be used as well. You know, there's lots of different ideas out there about how storage is going to work, and there's quite a bit of money going into research around that as well. I think that as we move to higher and higher percentages of renewables, we'll start to see the technology around storage evolve. We'll also start to see the ability to shift our usage to coincide with energy generation. Smart appliances, or you know, maintaining your temperature in your house over a day-long period instead of over a 10-minute long period will enable us as energy users to match when the wind's blowing or when the sun's shining. And I think there's no question we'll get there. It's a question of focusing on the step that's right in front of us, building on that step, and laying the groundwork to make it happen.
You know, we've actually taken a significant step down that road. There's a project outside of Gila Bend called Solana, and it's being built by Abengoa, and Arizona Public Service Company is going to buy the output. It's 280 megawatts, which is very big. 1 megawatt is one huge Walmart. And the exciting thing about that project is that it uses molten salt storage, and it's solar thermal. It's not photovoltaics, PV, that we've been talking about mostly, but it's solar thermal. So you have liquid being heated up, and then that hot liquid turns a steam turbine, and then the sun's heat is being stored in molten salt. And so that plant is going to store 6 hours worth of electricity in that salt. And the exciting thing about a state like Arizona is we're one of the hot states, us, Texas, where our peak load is at 6 p.m. And that's tough because it's not what they call coincident with the output of a PV panel. PV, I think, starts falling off at like 4 o'clock, Kevin, like 4 o'clock? Yep. So the beauty of this molten salt storage project is that it's going to keep making electricity 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, and that's what the utilities are worried about. Because our peak load is when everyone goes home from work, they walk in their door, and they turn on their air conditioner. And that's what the utilities are worried about, justifiably, and that's what we have to meet. That project is exciting not just for us, but for the whole country, because it's the first of its kind in this country like that.
Sounds great. One last thing before we go on to how we install solar energy. What about aesthetics? And that's a good lead-in, because I know that some homeowners association maybe don't like the idea of solar panels on the roofs. Have you run into that? Is that a problem? Are there federal guidelines that override the homeowners association?
Well, there are.
Rules?
It's state guidelines, actually. Arizona has a great state law that says homeowner associations can establish reasonable rules for solar equipment, but it can't decrease the efficiency or increase the cost. And so the old argument that solar panels are ugly, you can't put them on your house, just doesn't fly in our state. It's not a federal rule, it's a state rule, but it's a really important one. And getting to that aesthetic, I think one of the great developments in solar over the past few years is the increased variety of solar equipment you can buy. Now you can buy panels that are black and have black frames, or if you like the aluminum look, you can have that. There are now solar shingles being manufactured that look just like regular roofing shingles. In fact, some of that material is made here in Tucson. There are a variety of other ways of manufacturing solar so they blend in with different buildings from the get-go. So many of the aesthetic arguments, I think, are being removed by the increased variety of solar equipment that we're seeing coming along. And then the other thing, of course, is that in Tucson there's so many roofs that are flat that many solar installations, you wouldn't even know they're there. In fact, that's true of most city buildings. People are shocked when I tell them there are 20 city buildings that have solar, and they say, where are they? We had to put out a map for tourists and residents showing which buildings had solar on them, because you can't see them, because the parapets hide the solar panels, and they're up there making electricity, and nobody's the wiser.
I wouldn't skirt around it. There are people who think that solar panels don't look good. And it's not just solar panels, it's true of everything. You drive down the street and you look at somebody's house and you say, how did they do that to their house? It looks ugly. Well, some people feel that way. Other people look at solar panels and think, that's beautiful. Look at what those folks are doing. So I think you're always going to have that conflict. People are implementing projects on their own home that meet their own values and aesthetic and other motivations, and some of their neighbors are going to agree with that and celebrate it, and others are going to say, gosh, I wish they hadn't done that.
Sure. I think a lot of people don't know that you can lease solar panels, and you have two options: to purchase or to lease. My understanding is that purchasing them is the better investment in the long run, and that leasing them is the way to go if you can't afford to purchase them. Am I correct in that? And can we talk about the two?
Yeah. Let me just say that this industry, it's a new industry still. So up until 3 years ago, the only option for acquiring solar was to purchase it. And once they became available, take the tax credits yourself and make the investment that way. 3 years ago or so, we started to see the advent of a monthly lease. And the monthly lease is a financing tool. It's what we think of when we think about leasing. It's a way to offset your electric bill with solar, and instead of paying your electric bill, pay a lease payment. And that has been, it's a fantastic tool to extend the reach of who can install solar. Not everybody has $10,000 or $20,000 sitting around to invest in a project, whether they'd like to do it or not. So that was really an innovation, a financial innovation tool that's helping to expand access to solar in Tucson and around the country. Now, there are also, the industry has been changing very quickly, and we have in the last year seen an almost wholesale swap from customers who purchase systems themselves and own the system themselves to one of two forms of leasing, either that monthly lease or something called a prepaid lease, where you pay all of your lease payments up front and you get the benefit of the operation for 20 years. So these days, leasing is better financially one way or the other.
Okay. We have to move on here, but what happens when you sell your house quickly?
With the lease, you
yes.
have two options. The homeowner, if they qualify with the credit score, they can assume the lease at whatever rate the lease was at if it's monthly, or at no cost if it's prepaid, or you can buy out the lease at typically a value that's predetermined in the lease as part of the escrow process.
Okay. We are, believe it or not, running out of time. I'd like to give each of you a couple minutes to address what's important to you in this topic that we have not talked about yet. Nancy, do you want to start?
Yeah, I think to me it's kind of playing on that whole term life cycle analysis. So we have had the luxury in my lifetime of pretending that environmental pollution didn't matter, of pretending that so-called externalities, things like pollution, health effects, global warming, drought, crop damage, we've had the luxury of pretending that that didn't matter. When I was young, you know, the world was limitless. It wasn't such a finite place. And now we're at a time when it's time to start taking those things into account. So whether we're talking about coal with the global warming effects, the nitrous oxides, the sulfur dioxides, acid rain, whether we're talking about solar panels with the payback time of, you know, digging up the minerals, putting together the panels, we have to look at electricity in terms of life cycle analysis. We also have to recognize the risk factor. And more regulators around the country are thinking about these issues where, you know, for example, there was a huge natural gas explosion outside of San Francisco. Well, that was really expensive. So the bottom line is when you have fuel and pipelines and railroads, you've got risk. With renewable energy, no fuel risk.
Very good. Bruce?
Well, I think the main point I'd end with, Cynthia, is just the fact that solar is something that is a big part of southern Arizona. It's always been a part of the heritage of Arizona, but I think what's happened is we've been able to take advantage of that resource more and more in the past few years. So it's not just attracting tourists to come in the wintertime and get suntans. Now it's a way that you can actually run an economy. And I think one of the really exciting things about being in southern Arizona at this time is that we're seeing a lot of those new developments, some of the things that Kevin mentioned in the young industry we're seeing happening. And I think it's a really exciting time in the solar industry right now. And who knows what direction it's going to go, and who knows if we're going to start seeing solar clothing, which some people see on the horizon, or solar paint on the side of buildings that will be the panels. They won't be these panels that people argue about aesthetics. We'll see a building that's painted blue, and that blue paint will be the solar panel. So there's a lot of exciting things that are happening, as far as I'm concerned, in developing solar, and we're really early on in that process, and we're just seeing those new developments happening, which is really exciting for kids to be able to get interested in solar and be the ones that invent those new things that we haven't even thought of yet. So I think it's an exciting time for the industry, and it's an exciting time for Arizona. And the key really is for the citizens to make sure and push their leaders and the politicians to help that trend along and not hinder it due to any kind of short-sighted political or narrow thinking, but support that trend and make it happen and develop more and more into the future. But I'm an optimist, and I think we're going to see more and more solar development, and it's going to be great.
Great. Kevin, you have the last word. Oh.
Well, I think I think there's two really exciting things happening right now. One is that solar is more accessible to consumers than I have ever seen it be. In the 13 years I've been involved in the solar industry, more people can get access to it, put it on their roof, participate in generating their own electricity than ever. It still doesn't work for everybody, but anybody who wants to be involved in transitioning toward renewable energy, it's much closer. It's much lower upfront costs than it used to be 3, 4, 5 years ago. The technology has just advanced tremendously. So that's the one side that I think is really exciting. And the other side is that there is a very vigorous political dialogue happening right now in Arizona as well as nationally about how to move forward with renewables. And I think we're at these early stages, the first 10, 20 years of developing an industry that the decisions we make today are going to influence whether we end up at 50 or 100% renewables in the next 100 years, or whether we have some other energy mix. And the opportunities for Tucsonans to get connected to that dialogue and to be involved in our both the implementation as well as the policy decisions that get made is the opportunities waiting right in front of us. So, yeah.
Okay. I want to thank you, Kevin Cook, Nancy LaPlaca, Bruce Plank. It was a wonderful discussion. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for watching. I'd like to leave you all with a quote by Thomas Edison. "We are like tenant farmers chopping down the fence around our house for fuel, when we should be using nature's inexhaustible sources of energy, sun, wind, and tide. I'd put my money on the sun and solar energy. What a source of power. I hope we don't have to wait until oil and coal run out before we tackle that." Wasn't he a wise man? Thank you, all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, that's great.
Thanks. Thank you so much.